Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to change tone a little bit here because I'm not going to talk about code at all. I'm going to talk about how to produce code. And in particular, I'm going to talk about Agile. Not because, well, let's put it this way. I think Agile is by far the best way that we know to produce software. And at the same time, I think the notion of Agile software development is being completely destroyed by most of the Agile community. So when I talk about the death of Agile, what I'm really talking about is the death of what I think of as real agility and a replacement of real agility with a kind of fake agility that is suitable for corporations but doesn't really work in the real world. So let me explain exactly what I'm talking about. I would explain it if my clicker was working. There it is. So the reason I'm doing this talk is because as a consultant, I often come into companies and give them advice about Agile process. And I am just getting sick to death of dealing with the aftermath of the certified Scrum guys. And, right, is that they come in, they do their thing, and they leave this behind them. And there are a lot of issues surrounding that. But Scrum is really a problem, is the problem. It is not the solution. And the basic problem is the notion of a cargo cult. Now, the cargo cults happened in the Pacific Islands during World War II. The islanders were living happily on their islands without any cares in the world, eating fruit as it drops off of trees. But they were living in the Stone Age. A few minutes later, it seems, a bunch of soldiers land on the island. They make a runway, and then airplanes start landing. And the airplanes bring with them the 20th century. So all of a sudden, these guys have gone from the Stone Age to the 20th century because of these air bases. And 5 years later, all of those soldiers get back onto their airplanes, and they fly away. And the people who lived on the island are back in the Stone Ages. And what they saw were the airplanes. Is what they said, if we can only bring the airplanes back, they're going to bring back the cargo. So what they started doing is building things that look like airplanes in the hopes that if they build it, they will come. If the airplanes flying overhead see their brethren on the ground, they're going to land and bring the cargo with them, which of course didn't happen. Now, the problem with the cargo cult then is what they're doing is they're going through the motions. Is the guys in the cargo cults would build fake conning towers, and they would wear coconuts over their ears pretending to be headphones, and they would act as if they were a working airport in the hopes that the airplanes would land. And the problem is that we do this all the time, as we see cargo cults everywhere. And the biggest cargo cult of all, in fact, is the modern corporation. Is that corporations are cargo cults because they believe that there are certain ways to do things and they cannot conceive that there is another way of doing things. I participate a lot in one of the LinkedIn Agile groups. And one of the characteristics of this group is that there's a constant stream of wrong questions. There's a constant stream of questions that are so wrong that you don't even understand how someone can ask them in the context of Agile. Somebody will always say, well, every couple of weeks, somebody posts a question, what's the role of a project manager on the Agile team? And the answer is, there is no project manager on the Agile team. But people don't understand that, is that they're so convinced, because that's the way the corporations think, that a project manager is a necessary part of work, that they cannot imagine a world in which a project manager does not exist. So like the proverbial camel here, is that a corporation cannot fit through an eye of the needle, is that it can't make the changes that it needs to make because it's a cargo cult, because it does things over and over again by rote without really understanding why it's doing any of the things that it does. In particular, what they're looking for is a very specific process that they can follow. The corporations are really into process. Is that what they want to do is they want to do something easy. They want to bring in the trainers. They want to train a few people in the engineering department to follow some process. And they think that by following that process that there will be some sort of good result. But in fact, you don't get a good result by following a specific process. It just doesn't work. In other words, what the corporations want is this kind of Agile. Right? They want a canned thing, right? Something that you can just open up the can and do it, and it's somehow going to magically change the way that things work in a positive way. But often when they bring in the Agile, this kind of Agile, they don't really want to change the way things work. Because they just read about Agile someplace, and they think it's a good thing, and they think that there's going to be some kind of benefit, but they don't really know what the benefits are. So this is just really, really a bad idea. Now, what is Agile really? Agile is defined by the Agile Manifesto. And the Agile Manifesto, as you can see here, is very simple. There's only 4 points on it, and the first one is the most interesting one, is that the way that people work with one another is more important than processes. Now notice that it doesn't say instead of. Process is important. Agile has a lot of process associated with it, and the processes help. But the processes are not canned things. They're things that the individuals come up with as they interact with each other. In other words, the word agility has to apply to the process as much as it applies to anything else. If you're not agile in the way that you build software, then you're not going to be agile. So the whole notion of individuals and interactions over processes and tools has kind of fallen by the wayside. Scrum is a process. And a lot of people believe that Scrum and Agile are the same thing, and that's just wrong. Scrum is a process. So by saying we're doing Scrum, what you're saying is that the process is more important than the people that are doing the process, and that just is not going to work in any kind of situation. Now, my rule of thumb here then is to see if something makes sense. In any sentence where you see the word Agile, if you can replace that word with the word flexible, then you've got a proper sentence. If you say we do things in an Agile way, that works for me. If you say Agile says that we should do X, that doesn't work for me at all. What we want is flexibility. The whole point of Agile is to get agility. In other words, what we want to be able to do is we want to quickly adapt to changing requirements, be those changes coming from inside or outside. Either the customer is mandating them or we're mandating them because there's some internal process thing, some technology thing that changes, and we need to change internally. But what we need is agility. We need flexibility. We need the ability to change. And a corporation, at least many corporations, are incapable of doing that. So I suppose the one thing that I will agree with the Agile skeptics about is that I think the vast majority of large companies cannot ever be Agile, because it is the very nature of those large companies to not be flexible about things. Inflexibility is just built into things, right? So our rule of thumb here, what we have to work with then, is how do you define that it's Agile? If there is a significant requirements change, and it could be significant, right? I suddenly have to make this a cell phone app. Can you do it? That's the question. And can you do it quickly? You know, think about what's involved with making this change. There's a lot of training that has to go on. There's a lot of learning that has to go on. You might have to bring new people into the team in order to help you make the change, right? Our goal is to get the app into users' hands in a few weeks. Well, again, speaking as a consultant, I can tell you that when I'm hired to do training, often as long as 4 months elapses from the time that I'm first contacted by somebody who needs the training until the time that I can come in and actually give the training. Believe me, if it takes 4 months to get training, you're not Agile. So we have a corporate process that's there for some reason, right? Somebody has decided that corporate governance mandates that we have controls over our spending. And what that's doing is it's making it impossible for the organization to be Agile. Friction, Neil talked a moment ago about friction. This is what we're talking about here is friction. Is that what agility is really about is eliminating friction within the organization. And if you have an organization in which you cannot eliminate friction, the chances of you being Agile are basically zero. Which brings me to my second kind of major point here, is that the corporations believe that Agile just happens inside engineering. And that all that you do is bring in the trainers and teach them Scrum and you're done. But in fact, Agile is an organizational thing. There are no silos in an Agile organization. The organization as a whole is what's Agile. Not the teams, not the people on the teams, not the departments, but the entire organization. Because if I need my training, I need my training now. So if there's a separate finance department that's providing friction, that's getting in the way of me getting my training, there is no way that there's going to be any agility inside that organization. The next issue is equally important, is the organization is structured the way it is in order to support a process. It has a process and it must support it. If you change the process, you must also change the organization. Because if the organization is all built around supporting a waterfall process, for example, then you can't just suddenly become Agile without changing the support, because support for waterfall will not work if you're trying to support Agile. And there are lots of things that are part of Agile that people think of as things that cannot be changed, which have to be changed, right? The QA department. And this is one of the reasons it's so difficult for Agile to move into big corporations. In every Agile process that works, testing is integrated into the development process, tightly integrated. You're testing every 20 minutes on the outside. I test every 2 or 3 minutes as I'm programming. By the time the so-called sprint, the iteration is finished, the code is fully tested and ready to deploy, which is to say there's nothing for a QA department to do, which means that the director of QA is not going to be very happy about this, which means that he's going to be fighting really hard to prevent Agile from happening inside the organization because he's going to lose his job. Now, if it's really an Agile organization, he wouldn't lose his job, as what he would do is change his job in a flexible way so that he could actually do real QA, which is to say it would be his job to look at everybody's processes and make suggestions about how to improve them. But a lot of people are unable to make those changes because, again, they do not have the flexibility. Product development groups, they don't exist. In an Agile organization, the product is developed by the customers who are talking to you on a day-to-day basis. If your customer cannot walk in the front door of the corporation, you cannot be Agile. And it's very difficult for somebody who's not an employee of the corporation to walk in the front door, believe me. The governance practices, we were talking about finance-related practices a moment ago, is this basic idea of if I need the training, I need it now, not in 6 weeks. If I need a new piece of software, I need it now. An Agile team has a budget, and it spends it however they feel like it. The entire team decides to go off to a conference, they do that. They don't ask anybody, they just do it. If they need to buy a piece of software, they do it. Right, now they've got to manage their budget. The budget is not infinite. But they're the ones making the choice, not some separate governance-related organization. Deadlines. There is no such thing in the Agile world. All of the planning in Agile is based on priorities. All of it, 100% of it. We've all seen the iron triangle picture, right? Scope versus time versus money. Well, in Agile, the assumption is what's going to change most often is scope. Requirements always change. And if scope changes in a way that some event that needs to happen isn't going to happen, I have to release at some trade show, the only options you have are to reduce the scope a little bit or to increase spending, which is to say bring on another team. So if you're managing in an Agile world and you have a time deadline, if you will, that you're looking at, like a trade show, what you're doing is actually observing the process, is that Agile is a very transparent way of doing development and doing a projection based on the observed performance of the teams that are doing the work. And if your projection is not right, then you bring a new team on or you reduce scope. Those are your options. But there are no deadlines, there are no milestones, there's no estimation in the traditional sense. It just doesn't happen. That's a hard one for people to give up, but there we go. So there aren't any timesheets because you don't need them. You're not doing time-based stuff. There's no kind of organizational friction. Is that there's a basic lean concept that any effort or time or energy being spent doing something that is not directly supporting putting valuable software into the hands of the users, that's all waste. Filling out an expense report or a timesheet is not providing customer value. So one of the things that an Agile organization has to do is reduce friction by eliminating everything that is in the way of putting value into the hands of the customers, including all of this junk that we've just been talking about. There is no project management in Agile. You trust people to do the work. The teams manage themselves. There's no middle managers at all, in fact, in an Agile world. So all of this stuff has got to go. And big corporations are not going to do it, is they are cargo cults. They believe that all this stuff is necessary for a company to function, and that a company who doesn't do this cannot function. And that's nonsense, of course. There are some very large companies that function quite well in an Agile way. But most companies don't believe that that's the way things are going to work. They have their managers and they expect them to work like managers. And more to the point, when some things become Agile, they expect that these same people are just going to change their job titles and suddenly everything's going to be fine, right? And that's not what it is, right? Is that the job titles is not just a change in title. It's a basic change in what you do. Agile companies are organized very differently. This is Spotify. People talk a lot about scaling Agile. Spotify has about 500 programmers in it right now, which is big enough for me to say this model will work regardless of the size of the company. I would argue that if you have a project that requires more than 500 programmers, that what you need to do is break up that project into smaller projects. There is no project on the planet that requires more than 500 programmers, I'm sorry. In fact, most projects with 500 programmers on them could be done quite well by 5 programmers. So if Spotify can do this, we can scale. I'm not going to spend a lot of time looking at this picture, but the main thing that I want to point out here is that we do not have a hierarchy. We do not have a org chart that's in a tree form with managers and controls and that kind of stuff. We have a kind of matrix, though this isn't a classic matrix organization, but there's no boss. The individual tribes, which are groups of groups, if you will, do have one guy, a system architect, who's effectively a member of all of the teams, whose job is to make sure there's some architectural coherence across the systems that the people are building. But he's not ordering people around either. He's saying, well, you know, we're doing this over here already, so if we do it this way instead, it'll all fit better. And this is a process for grown-ups, so the people on Team B say, okay, we'll do it that way then, because they're being flexible. So nobody's ordering anybody around. This is a very collaborative kind of process. Which brings us to Scrum. Is that Scrum is none of the things that I was just talking about. It's a fixed process. It has two characteristics that a lot of people don't know about. Is first of all, if you look at all the processes in the world, all the Agile processes in the world, Scrum is one of them. And people equate Scrum to Agile. I don't know how many times I've heard people say, well, Agile says X when they mean Scrum says X. The second problem is that Scrum is a relatively small thing, and Agile is a relatively big thing. There's a lot associated with Agile, and in fact, Agile is not really even just Agile, is that lean techniques have a lot to do with running an effective company in an Agile way. So it's even bigger than one guy here. Scrum is a very small thing. Scrum is defined by a 16-page document. And frankly, you can't define any process in a 16-page document. It just can't be done. So it's very small. More to the point, the Scrum guys imagine that Scrum can be done in a kind of bubble, where nobody outside has to care about what's going on inside that bubble. But we were just seeing people do have to care. Is that the purchasing procedures of the organization affects what goes on inside the bubble. So it's not a separate bubble. It's not something that can be isolated. The Scrum guys also have no respect at all for the existing processes of the organization when they come in. As they imagine they can just bulldoze those processes out of the way and replace them with Scrum, but what they're really replacing them with is nothing. Because the Scrum is not going to work in a situation where you're not changing the entire organization. And if Scrum is not going to work, people are not going to do it. A lot of times when you see the organizations that have brought in the Scrum guys, a year later they're not doing anything even close to Scrum anymore. Because they're not getting the support they need to make it work, so they don't do it. In terms of the smallness, you look at extreme programming, and extreme programming is made up of a larger set of practices. The interesting thing about this is the practices are all interwoven and interlocked in complex ways. For example, one of the key practices in extreme programming is that you need to be testing all the time. You're testing every 2 or 3 minutes as you're writing the code. Another important practice in extreme programming is constant aggressive refactoring. Is that every time you look at a piece of code, if it's not right, you fix it. But the fact is, you can't do that if you don't have your tests in place. You can't cherry pick these. They all mesh together to make one unified process. Now, you can modify this process, and in fact, the XP teams do that all the time, but they know what they're doing. They understand, well, I have these benefits, and this has this interaction with those things, and if I change this, then I have to change this other stuff too in order to compensate. You look at Scrum, though, and what have they done? First of all, they have cherry-picked 2 things. They have stolen the XP planning game directly. Scrum planning is nothing but extreme programming planning. And then they have stolen a bunch of the little stuff, stand-up meetings and that kind of stuff. And then they've taken 2 other things and transmogrified them to the point where they're unrecognizable. The whole team, among other things, says you should have an actual customer in the room with you. People think that when you're doing extreme programming, you don't do design. That's nonsense. What you are doing is you're doing the design incrementally as the program evolves. Instead of spending 3 months talking to a user before you start coding, you put the user in the room with you so you can ask him the question immediately before you start coding. The user interaction is still there. You're still talking to your users. You're still doing design, but you're doing it as you're working. Well, they've gotten rid of the user, and they've replaced it with this management lackey called the project manager, or the product owner, rather. Right? The product owner is not a customer. The product owner is usually a representative of the marketing department. So all of the guarantees that you'll get about building valuable software, they're gone. And then they put in the rigid time box, which they call a sprint, which is also a huge waste of time. Think how much waste there is in trying to size a story so you can do it in a 2-week sprint. And think of all of the Sturm und Drang that happens when you're 1 day off. Right? We're at the end of the sprint, but there's still 1 more day's work to do. And that's such a hassle that often people don't do that day's work, and you end up with buggy software. And that's just not okay. So this is flying in the face of agility also. This stuff just doesn't work. The next problem has to do with the certification mills, which produce certificates, which have no value at all. You take a 16-page Scrum guide, you read through it. So I've spent an afternoon curled in front of the fire with my Scrum guide. I go online, I take a completely automated test, which is graded by a computer, comprised of 35 multiple choice questions. I get a grade of 60%. I don't know about you, but when I was in elementary school, 60% was considered a failing grade. But if I get a failing grade, that's good enough. I get my certificate. I am a master now. The problem is that those corporations think of this as some kind of diploma. They think of the certificate as being meaningful. And because they do that, what you get is something that is actively destructive. Because if you imagine that the guy that has the certificate is competent and he's not, and things don't work, you don't blame the guy. You blame the thing that he's supposed to be competent in doing. You say Agile doesn't work. You don't say that certified Scrum guy didn't actually know what he was talking about. So certification is not only meaningless, it is actively destructive, especially when companies use certification as a criteria for hiring, because it doesn't tell them anything useful. They bring in people that don't know anything about agility, but they're certified, and then they imagine that they're somehow agile. It just doesn't work. Now, the worst case of this is SAFe. The problem with SAFe is that SAFe is designed to be acceptable to a corporation. But it's not. SAFe, that is. In other words, if you look at SAFe, it's just the same old, same old. At the bottom, you've got Scrum, which is barely agile. In the middle, you've got the same old stuff that you always used to do. Well, we haven't accomplished anything real here. We looked at those flat hierarchies a moment ago. You don't have a flat hierarchy in SAFe. You just have the same old corporate hierarchy that you ever had. All the governance stuff is still in place. It's not real. And it's not necessary. Agile scales just fine. We saw that with Spotify. Why do we need to do this special thing? And it's because, again, the corporation is a cargo cult. They can't imagine taking a big project and breaking it up into smaller projects. So this is fake Agile. This isn't real Agile. Now, mixed into this is a whole set of tool vendors who are supporting this dysfunction. Is that all of these tools force you into working in an old-style way, is that what they're doing is taking waterfall-style management and trying to impose that on top of Agile process by doing ridiculous things like burn-down charts. They're a complete waste of time, as you spend more time entering data into this thing than you get useful information out of it, and that time is waste. It's time not spent providing direct customer value. What do you need when you do Agile in the way of tools, right? What is Agile exactly? And the thing is that Agile is basically very, very simple. What Agile is, first of all, is that it's a culture. And the culture is the most important thing, not the process. And again, I'm not saying process isn't important, but a specific process is no better than any other specific process, provided that it's working out within a culture of agility. So for Agile to work, you have to put the proper culture in place, which is to say that Agile infusion, in order to be functional, has to come from the top down. It is the CEO's job to manage the culture of the organization. So if the CEO does not understand what agility is about, there is no way that he or she is going to set up a culture that supports it. So culture is central. The second issue is trust. Everything in Agile depends on trusting people to do their job. In other words, you don't have managers. Well, why don't you have managers? And it's because I trust people to do work. I don't need to sit there with a bullwhip and crack it over their heads in order to get them to work. I trust them. And you get trust up and down the chain. I don't need to make them get sign-offs in order to go to a conference because I trust them to assess their abilities, understand that if they go to the conference they can increase those abilities, and then let them go. It's all about trust. The other issue is that the things on the left here, communication, simplicity, courage, all these values and principles, inform the things on the right, the practices. Is that the practices exist because the principles exist. And the principles exist because the values exist. So unless you have those principles and values in place, the practices that you come up with are not going to be functional. So we get back to the principles, to the basic principles, is that everything depends on, ultimately, communication and simplicity and courage and feedback. And if you don't have that inside the organization as a whole, then you can't really do functional work. Is everyone following what I'm getting at here? This is probably the most important thing that I can say, is that the culture is more important than anything, and that the principles are more important than the practices. And that any practice that works in the framework of the principles is a good practice, at least from an Agile point of view. The process itself is very simple. You start off by talking to your customers and find out what they need. And then you break off a small chunk of that, and you build it, and you give it to them. That's it. Everything else is icing. And you do this on a small loop, right? That loop is a 2-week loop. And the reason it's a 2-week loop is because the general assumption of all the Agile processes is that people don't know what they need until they have something in their hands. So upfront requirements gathering doesn't work because the requirements that you gather are never correct. So the process itself is very simple. The tools for the process are very simple. You need a whiteboard, you need some Post-it notes, you need some index cards and some thumbtacks, and that's it. If you're working remotely, maybe you'll mix a couple other things into this. You need some good communication software. You probably need to take that whiteboard and put it into a computer someplace. But that's inferior, actually. As Agile is all based on face-to-face communication. 2 people physically standing in front of a physical board will be able to do better work than 2 people working electronically. The real problem with the electronic version is that it's hidden inside the computer instead of being sitting up on the wall where you can see it every day when you're walking by it. So when it's hidden, you tend to not think about it. If it's a physical thing, it's out there where you can think about it. So those are all the tools you need. And again, we go back to our corporations, and they're not thinking in these terms. They're thinking in terms of big, expensive tools because they've decided that that's what they need in order to handle this complexity that's completely unnecessary. And we don't need any of that. We need very simple things. So we come back to the basic Agile principles. We finished the first one. Let's look at the other ones. Our main goal here is to produce working software. Now, over comprehensive documentation, there are still some corporations that have a documentation fetish, but they're getting to be less and less as time progresses. General rule of thumb is that if nobody's ever going to read anything, don't bother to write it. The vast majority of documentation is never read by anybody. So it's not valuable. It's waste. It's another example of waste. But by documentation, they don't just mean software documentation. They mean all paperwork inside the organization. Any kind of paperwork that's getting in the way of producing the working software is not desirable. You want to collaborate with your customers, not negotiate with them. Customers don't know what's hard. So they often ask for things that you can't build. A negotiation leads to dysfunction. I want you to do such and such. And I'm saying, sure, I'll have it next week. There was an XKCD comic that was to this effect a couple weeks ago. And then somebody comes in a few minutes later and says, I need this other thing. And you go, sure, I need 15 research assistants and a $7 million budget, and I'll have it for you in 8 years. And the person who's asking the question is often the same person. They don't know that one thing is hard and another thing is not hard. Well, if you negotiate, the next thing that person is going to say, how about 3 years with 8 research assistants? And you go, no, well, maybe 4, right? And this is not solving the problem. For one thing, even the 15 research assistants in 5 years or 8 years is a guess. So negotiating is not going to help any. If you collaborate, though, you sit down and you go, no, that's a really hard problem. But if we make this little change, it turns into a really easy problem. Do you think that'll work? And then the guy who comes in with the idea says, well, yeah, maybe. But if we do this other little thing, maybe it'll work a little bit better, and you collaborate. So this goes way beyond contracts. This goes into the way that you work on a day-to-day basis. You need to be able to respond to changes at all levels. I just said a moment ago that that the word Agile applies to the process itself. If the process isn't working, change it. Notion of retrospectives comes out of this, but the most functional Agile teams do not do retrospectives. Because a highly functional Agile team will instantly recognize that something's not working. Everybody will huddle together, they'll come up with a solution, they'll put the solution in place, and then they'll move on. A retrospective is kind of a transitional measure. It's something that you need before you get good enough to be able to make those changes quickly. Then there are the principles. Let's look at just a few of them. The welcoming changes of requirement, even late in development. Right? And the basic notion of harnessing the change for the customer's competitive advantage is important here. Is that an Agile team is in a service role. It's their job to solve other people's problems. Not to do stuff because it's cool, and not to do stuff because it's techie and it makes them feel good, but to do stuff because it improves the bottom line of the customer, whoever that customer should be. The requirements are going to change. They always change. So setting up things where they can't change is not going to work. Another flaw in Scrum is they say once the Scrum starts, there will be no changes. Well, what's that about? I'm 5 minutes into the Scrum and I realize that we got a requirement wrong and we can't make any changes? It's not going to work, because you have to accept them at any point in the process. The developers and the business people are working together on a daily basis. That means they're in the same room with each other. That does not mean that they send memos back and forth. That does not mean that the business people ask nicely before they do something arbitrary anyway. It means that they're on the team, literally. They're sitting in the same room. You're talking on a day-to-day basis. The individuals are more important than anything, and that it is the job of the company to support the individuals. If you have a situation where somebody has to argue in order to get the support they need to do their job, there's no way that you're going to have any agility. The constant pace issues have to do with the way, again, most corporations work. Deadlines, milestones, all of this stuff. What this is a way to manipulate people into working overtime. Company meals, high-quality cafeterias inside the building. That's all manipulation. That's all ways to get you to work overtime. Agile companies will not do that because they know that tired people can't do good work. You have to be able to come in every day rested and ready to go, and if you can't do that, you can't be Agile. The teams themselves have to organize themselves. Right? I did a class yesterday. At the end of the class, we did an exercise. I said, we're going to go on a break. When I get back, I want you guys broken up into 4 groups of 5 or 6. I want you to pick a project that you're going to work on. And then I left them alone. And I came back and they did it. Well, the organization has to work that way. You don't assign people to teams. You don't break up teams. Teams form. They do the job, and then maybe they reform, but usually not. They usually stay together as a team, and that's best. But it's up to the teams to make those decisions, not some sort of management layer. So I'm going to finish this by thinking about Charles Darwin. Is that Agile is by far the most effective way to develop software. And the companies that do things in an Agile way are going to have a huge evolutionary competitive advantage over the companies that don't. Those big corporations that I was just talking about, they're the dodos. Is that they'll keep doing what they're doing, but their competitors who are working in an agile way are not limited in the same way that the corporations are limiting themselves. So they're going to just wither away. Maybe this should be a picture of Marx instead of a picture of Darwin. But the point, in other words, the point that I'm making is that eventually evolution will help us here. Eventually the companies that can't do things in an agile way will cease to exist. But most companies don't have that as a goal. It's not part of their corporate mission statement that they will cease to exist in 5 or 10 years because the competitor can move faster. So really, when it comes to agility, we have no choice. We have to embrace change and just do it. So that's what I have to say.